All right, so now be honest, okay? I'm going to put you on the spot here. How many of you are Lost watchers? Would you raise your hand? Okay, all right. So you just admitted, along with myself, that you are a wicked and vile sinner for watching such a show. But that's okay, because the sermon is for us today. I believe, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about the premise of the show if you've not seen it before, so you'll know what we're talking about. I believe, and this is just my assessment along with some others, that the most significant loss, the most dramatic cultural change in the 20th century, and now we're of course in the 21st century, is the decline of personal integrity. All right, so you can weigh that for yourself for a moment. I don't know, we lost Aaron. Is Aaron in here? Can you guys hear me okay? Some of you kind of look like you're straining to hear with this microphone. Can somebody come up, and Stephanie, right, and adjust that, or somebody? Okay, great. Sorry about that. They'll get it up here in just a second. So what do we mean when we say personal integrity? Personal integrity is very simply the way in which we live our lives according to God's truths. If we do that, then we have personal integrity. If we fail to do that, then we lack personal integrity. Now, I want to say to you right now, because some of you are kind of tricked a little bit earlier, and I apologize for that, but all of us are guilty in this area. All right? There's not one of us, not me, not my wife, as righteous as she is. She's like my golden right hand of righteousness. She helps me whenever I falter, and she shows me the error of my way. But not even her, as great a lady as she is perfect in this area. So we all have a road to travel. We all have a distance to travel. Even those of us that are older and more spiritually mature have distance to travel. So it's something that, you know, sometimes when we discuss a topic and you might think, well, yeah, I don't struggle with that as much. But this is something that applies to everyone. And if you think that it doesn't apply to you, oh gosh, and we need to really have a discussion. I really need you to open your heart and listen as we discuss this today. Over the course of the last 60 years, we have moved from a culture with low divorce rate, low crime, low media lewdness, so on and so forth, to that of a culture that is among the highest in the world. So our integrity, our character, as being a high standard for our culture, has completely eroded away to almost, not nothing, but almost nothing. The loss of innocence with our children, the decay in the workplace, in the school, in the church, has become so epidemic. It has become so bad that lives are completely destroyed. Every second. I don't know what the statistic would be, but lives are just destroyed utterly and completely because of a lack of personal integrity. And so it is imperative for us as believers, as we go completely against the culture, which is going this direction, God is calling us to move back against the stream, against the rush, the flood of the water of lewdness and immorality, and to fly in its face against that. Lost is a TV series. It came out, I believe, the first year in 2006-ish, somewhere in there. It ran for 6 seasons and was about the crash of Oceanic Flight 815 that disappeared over the South Pacific and was not heard from for some time. And the survivors of the crash found themselves on this mysterious island where, as the show goes on, you discovered by probably not until the 4th or 5th season that it was kind of this epic spiritual and philosophical battle between free will and predestination or determinism. And so the whole show was kind of this theological debate between those two items. And so, of course, it was not really from a Christian worldview necessarily, but those two ideas of there being this omnipotent being that kind of moves through the course of things and acts in time and in space and in the lives of people was at conflict with the lack or the void of that truth. And so it's a very very interesting show. I've watched it the whole thing through one time, and then again with my children. Although there's some parts of the show that are not appropriate, so we've kind of censored that as we go. I tend to, as a parent, not let my children watch things that I have not watched. So it puts me in a position to where I can know what's coming, and I can help protect them from some of those things. Although I would like to point out and state, while we're talking about character and integrity, if our children shouldn't watch something, then should we? Just a question. Just think about that. Why is it okay for us and not for them? Maybe it's not okay. Just a question. All right. Well, we're going to look at a little clip to kind of help us think about this idea of what we've lost. Because in a way, we're a lot like the survivors of Oceanic Flight 815. And we find ourselves, once we've been redeemed by Christ, we find ourselves lost on this strange island. We're surrounded by all kinds of unusual things. I mean, as the crash survivors go through the show, they discover this giant hatch that's in the ground. They discover these Dharma stations where all kind of strange experiments have been going on. And just all these unusual things happen. And really, we find ourselves in that same place as believers. And sometimes we don't realize it because we've so intertwined ourselves in the culture, and we've allowed ourselves to decay along with it, and we don't even recognize it. So I think the starting place for us is to realize how depraved we really are, how sinful and selfish and immoral that we truly are. And you might say, well, I don't do any of those things, but even in our minds, if we don't commit the actual acts of immorality, then are we pure in our minds? Do we have a desire to do those things? Do we meditate on things that are holy and pure? Or do we allow our mind to become conformed to the world and the world's way of seeing things? So to help us do that, Alan is going to play a short video clip from one of my favorite older TV shows, The Andy Griffith Show. This is a show that first came out in 1960, so it really has a 1950s feel. If you're kind of familiar at all with the different decades, I've tried to make myself a student of some of the different decades of the United States culture in the 20th century, because I think it helps us understand where we were and where we've come, what we've lost, and the things that we need to understand now. Before we idolize a certain era in time, because I think we could probably say generally that the early part of the 20th century, there was still an idea at least, or an ideal in our culture, that morality and truthfulness, honesty, integrity, that was a value that was held high. It wasn't something that was made fun of or disregarded or ignored. It was held high, and we can see that in a lot of the shows of that era. And so even though this show is actually filmed and takes place during the 1960s, the cultural mindset is very much that of the mid to late 1950s. So go with us for a few moments back in time as we see some of the cultural icons and ideology of those times. And David, would you bring the lights down for us as he does that?
Bye. Well, if it ain't Charlie Moneybags, the big philanthropist, how do you do?
What you talking about, Pa?
I'm talking about the underprivileged children's drive.
Oh, they collected for that at school, Pa.
Oh, I know they did. Oh, I know they did. And when they called your name, you gave a large, generous amount of 3 cents. My, that was big on you, Diamond Jim.
Did I give him too much, Pa? I could ask him to give back 2 cents.
Yeah. We got to talk about this thing. Now, look here, Opie. You can't give a little bitty piddling amount like 3 cents to a worthy cause like the underprivileged children's drive. I was reading here just the other day where there's somewhere like 400 needy boys in this county alone, or 1.5 boys per square mile.
There is?
It sure is.
I never seen one, Pa.
Never seen one what?
A half a boy.
Well, it's not really a half a boy, it's a ratio.
Horatio who?
Not whole ratio, a ratio. It's mathematics, arithmetic. Look now, Opie, just forget that part of it. Forget the part about the half a boy.
It's pretty hard to forget a thing like that, Pa. Poor Horatio.
Now, Horatio is not the only needy boy.
But I'll be running along now. Bye, Andy.
Okay, so in this clip, I hope that, and of course you didn't have time to think about it like I did, and I watched some other clips as well. And actually, I've been going through watching the show. It's on Netflix. All the seasons you can watch on Netflix if you're a Netflix subscriber. So, for one, it is interesting to me that it was common and normal for the interaction between father and son to happen. And that's something that, for many of us, that's not a normal thing. We're so busy, we're so wrapped up that we don't immediately think, okay, what's happening with our children at school, that's our concern. That's something that we should immediately be involved in. And so in this particular clip, Opie undergave, all right, and again, that was a cultural expectation at that time. If there was a needy cause and you didn't give to it, or if you didn't give significantly enough to it, then you had failed in some way. All right, that's just a small sense. See, we don't have that anymore. I mean, you check out at Walmart or wherever, and there's 1,000 different things. Of course, back then, you didn't quite get as many causes kind of thrown at you. But there's so much marketing, and you never know now, well, how much of that money actually goes to help that need. So it's just very complicated, and we've kind of lost some important values there. But we can see that just a little bit, the contrast with how people perceived things and how they acted, what was important in these types of shows compared to now. If not really any of the shows that we could really compare and contrast that with are appropriate for church or even for us to watch at all anyway. And so I think probably, though, we can all imagine, because we're all guilty probably of watching things that we ought not to, and we realize in watching those shows that the values that our culture holds today are very different than what they were. So, where did these values of this time, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, we kind of lost in the 60s. My argument would be the 1960s was probably the most detrimental decade for the U.S. It was very positive in some ways because there were some groups of people that got some well-deserved rights that they needed to have. But in terms of morality, we began a very steep decline. And so prior to that time, though, where did that high moral standard come from? Well, let's look at 1 Samuel 12, if you've got a way to view the Scriptures. And I want us just to read those first 4 verses. And basically what we're going to read is, this is, Samuel was a prophet in the Old Testament, one of the first of a series of prophets that kind of saw the decline of Israel and Judah, and he was really kind of the beginning of the end of that period in their history. And let's see what is said about Samuel here. Again, that's 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1. Samuel said to all Israel, "I have done everything you have requested. I have given you a king. Now look, this king walks before you. As for me, I am old and gray. And though my sons are here with you, I have walked before you from the time of my youth till the present day. Bring a charge against me before the Lord and before His chosen king. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I stolen? Whom have I wronged? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I taken a bribe, so that I would overlook something? Tell me, and I will return it to you." And they replied, "You have not wronged us or oppressed us. You have not taken anything from the hand of anyone." And so can that be said about you and about me? So that's a high standard to live our entire lives and to be able to give an account that we were trustworthy, that we were honest, that we were above reproach. And for many of us, I fear that it is difficult for us because we have to be truthful with ourselves and realize that all of the influences in our life, all the choices that we've made, oftentimes have led us down a path of compromise. Compromise isn't a bad thing. When you have 2 warring parties and one person has this position, another person has this position, and sometimes you meet in the middle, that's a good kind of compromise. So sometimes we say that as an ugly word, and compromise can be a good thing. Sometimes we need to compromise. But the type of compromise that I'm talking about in this particular context is the one where we take that high standard of morality that God has set out for us, and we try to meet Him halfway. We say, well, I'm not a serial killer, God, but boy, I sure hate this person over here, and I really wish they would die. So maybe we can compromise somewhere between that, and our hearts become black because of sin. So what are some common examples? Because sometimes I think it's hard for us when we're in the midst of that. You know, it's kind of like, and not that I'm comparing us to pigs, I guess I am a little bit. But, you know, it's hard for them to realize that the dirt and the nastiness that they wallow in is actually yucky. You know, they're used to that, and they like that, and they like to roll around in it because they don't really know any better. They're kind of just, you know, stinky creatures. You know, but they taste good once they're cleaned up and cooked, and yum. All right, so here's some common examples, all right, that I see, and maybe some of these I've been guilty of, maybe some of these I've seen others be guilty of, all right? Most of these are smaller things, all right? Ordering water at the restaurant and getting soda. Feeling guilty yet? Misrepresenting or marketing something to sell and advertising it as better than it is. All right, whether it's eBay, whether it's Craigslist, you're like, oh, well, I'll do this and that, and, you know, whoever buys it, well, too bad for them. Trying to use a coupon that's expired, or that the coupon is for a different purpose, you're trying to use it for a different purpose than what it states. Pirating, that just means stealing or copying books, music, movies, video games, the list goes on. So in other words, if you didn't pay for it and you have a copy of it, then there's a little bit of a problem there because somebody got stolen from, the person that holds the rights to that. Lying, all types of lying. Small lies, exaggerations, just kind of bending the truth a little bit. Slothfulness, laziness. What? That doesn't have anything to do with morality. The fact that I don't want to get up and work every day and I just want to kind of lay around and be unproductive, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? Well, the Bible says, and this is something that comes up in our household frequently with our children, although most of them are pretty hard workers, the Bible says, if a man will not work, neither shall he eat. Something to think about. Using things at work or for personal use without permission. Now I realize sometimes, you know, we ask, and, you know, can I use these things, or can I use the copy machine, can I do this, can I do that, and we have permission, that's not a problem. But what if we use those things without permission and we're taking advantage and we're costing the company that we work for money, and they didn't give us permission to do that? What about manipulation? You know, some of us are masters of manipulation, and we whine, we connive, we blackmail, we try to talk people into things that are in our best interest and not theirs. See, a lot of these things are kind of small, and you might even think they're a little bit silly, but they are evidence. They are symptoms of the greater problem that we have, and that is a lack of personal integrity. What are some larger examples? Well, viewing pornography, violent crimes, marital unfaithfulness, dishonest business practices, alcohol abuse, substance abuse, debauchery. I mean, the list goes on. And they get worse as we begin to tiptoe and to step in to immorality in our life. It just becomes a slippery slope, and we become like those pigs that get used to the mud, and we just get used to that. We get, you know, one word, when I was growing up, it was a big word that people talked about a lot, and that was desensitization, or being desensitized. You know, people, parents and teachers and people that were authority figures in my life, I heard them constantly arguing about this. You know, that whether or not this show or that show or this type of media, you know, desensitize you. In other words, it makes you hard, or it makes you apathetic or complacent about how terrible something is. You know, we don't talk about that so much anymore because I think that battle got lost, basically. But it is a problem that once we get used to a certain sin, we don't see it as grievous anymore. Now here's the problem. Here's where we start to get off a little bit. See, the church has this dilemma. It's kind of like an addiction to clubbing, I guess. That what we like to do is we get to this place where somebody, you know, usually somebody preaching or teaching or something, they put us in a nasty place, the place that we're all at right now, where we think to ourselves, man, I do not like where this is going. I don't like the way this is making me feel right now. Okay? You should feel some shame. You should be ashamed. I should be ashamed. We should all be ashamed of the compromise that we allow into our lives. But there's two ways to deal with that. See, the way that the church traditionally has dealt with that over the last 50 or 60 years, instead of having compassion and of facing the problem, all right, what we've done is we've ignored the problem, And we've gone on in this imaginary world that everything's okay when it's not. And 2, anybody that didn't cooperate with our little imaginary world, we clubbed them and we beat them and we said, go away, we don't want you to be part of our church anymore. And that in itself is completely contradictory to the way that God intended us to be as a church. God created the church to be a life-saving station. A place where people that are hurt, that are wounded by sin, can be redeemed, can find truth. That's what the church is supposed to be. It's not it's not like this giant. I mean, when I was a kid, you know, the preachers and everybody and the staff, they would sit on the thrones. You guys remember the thrones? You know, the big tall. You know, it's kind of like for me when I came to church a little bit, and I'm not criticizing your church. All right, this is like most churches during the 1980s, 1970s. Okay, that you come in, you see these men. They're usually kind of old, you know, and they're sitting on these big thrones. They're in suits and they're looking real sophisticated, you know, real righteous, kind of like the Pope, you know, except they're missing the Pope hats. I always thought it'd be cool if they had like the Pope hats, kind of, you know, the real tall ones. Bobby's always bugging me about getting a Pope hat, and I won't let him have one while he's painting, mostly because you wouldn't see the painting, but also because that's kind of weird. And they're just sitting there, and they're just righteous, and it's almost like they're condemning us, you know, and we come in and we feel small, and we're way down here, and they're way up there. And so we gave this image like church is a place where you were going to be judged. You were going to be condemned. But who is the one that's the judge? God. We're not the judge. Okay, that's from an old 80s show. I don't know if anybody got that. I'm trying to remember the name of the show. I can't think of it. But there's the mom and the not the mom. Was that Fraggle Rock? That was any Fraggle Rock watchers? Boy, I'm dating myself now. Yeah, okay, sorry guys. I just drew you along with that. Funny show. All right, so when we think about this, we have to think about it correctly. And not point the finger or try to deny the problem that we have, even in the church. What we've got to do is realize that we are a life-saving station, that it is our responsibility to recognize our own struggles, our own sin, and to help others out of theirs as well. But see, part of immorality, part of the slide is selfishness. And so when we only care about ourselves, that means that everybody else is left out. I mean, can you imagine? What if you had a way, like there was this giant, we talked about loss, you know, what if you came upon this giant hatch in the ground and opened up and there was this huge cache of money, of let's just call it pure gold, because gold I think is more valuable than currency at the moment. So this pure, big, huge thing of gold. Now, what if it was unlimited? Okay, so in other words, when you take gold out of it, there's still gold, more gold just materializes inside. So it's this endless supply of gold, okay? Now, if you are a caring and loving person, what you'll do is you'll go and tell everybody that you know that there's gold buried in the ground and they can go get it and take it to the bank and they're going to be rich. And you know what we do as believers? We cover up the opening and walk away as if there was no gold buried in the ground. And we forget to tell anybody, and so they're poor. And you know what? Our nation is spiritually poor because we have failed to share that truth, that gold mine, with people in our lives. And in fact, we have condemned them, and we have judged them, and we've given up on them when we ourselves are yet sinners. Let's look at Daniel chapter 6. I want to read this story. Now, if you know your Bible at all, you'll think, oh, Daniel chapter 6, that's the story of what? Daniel and the lion's den. Yeah, good job. Daniel and the lion's den. Now, this is a great story. This is not a children's story. Okay? This is a violent, R-rated story. Okay? There's women and children that are eaten by lions and all kinds of things, okay? So, but we're going to read it hopefully in kind of the G version. But this is a violent and terrible story, and yet it helps us understand the value of standing firm, of going against the wake and the current of a culture that is experiencing moral decay. Let's read that together. Daniel chapter 6. Darius decided, okay, he's the big dog. He's the king of Persia. all right, which is kind of like, Iran and in the Arab area back there. Persia was one of the largest empires in the world at the time, just before the Roman Empire. And a lot of the Roman Empire was built on the Persian Empire because of some of their civilization and technology and such. And so Darius, who's the king, he decides to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom. Okay, those are kind of like vassals, kind of like lords. Those of you who know your medieval history, and that's how it kind of worked. There was a king, and then lord, vassal, baron, marquis, prince, I don't know, all those titles, but somebody was over somebody who was over somebody else, that kind of idea. So you got these satraps, they're stationed throughout the realm, and then also there are 3 administrators. Okay, one of them was Daniel. And so that put him in a very high place. And he was one of the few people in the Persian Empire that actually worshiped God still, was still faithful to Yahweh. All right, that's the name of the one true God, the God that we worship. And so these satraps, going on in verse 2, would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Okay, in other words, so people wouldn't steal from the king, basically. They're his representatives. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the entire realm. Well, the administrators and the satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. All right, so this is your typical work situation where you're at work, you're doing a good job, you're an honest employee. That makes the other people that you work with mad because they're not, and they're jealous, and then they work to do you in. All right, that's a familiar story. I think we can identify with that a little bit, although this is on a much more significant scale. But they found, I'm continuing on in verse 4, they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, no negligence was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." All right, so they think, okay, well, you know what? We're going to try to manipulate this situation a little bit to our advantage. So the administrators and satraps went together to the king, and they said to him, "May King Darius live forever." Okay, so, they're kind of kissing up to the king. "All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den." Okay, now why did they do that? Okay, let's just think about that. Why did they do that? Because they knew that Daniel was an honest and good and faithful man, and he was going to be true to the God that he worshipped. And so if they got him to if they created a law that would be in contrast with his own personal spiritual law, they knew they would have him, and that he would break the law, and they would finally get him. Verse 8, "Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the document. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, what did he do? Now watch this. He went into his house. The windows in his upper room were opened. Okay, now let's just think about that. Why would you open your windows? Because you want other people to see what you're doing. Right? If you don't, you would close the windows. Now in our houses, we have blinds or things. We don't necessarily open our windows. Some of us do. If your windows actually function and open, then that's a good thing. But we can close the blinds, that way people don't see us. But Daniel deliberately opens them towards Jerusalem, which was the custom. You would pray towards Jerusalem, the holy city. And going on, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. All right, so this was not a change. He wasn't deliberately trying to be hard to get along with and do something he didn't always do. But he continued what he did, and he wasn't going to hide that fact. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel. Why did they find him? Because they were looking for him. They were trying to trick him. Sounds a little bit like the Pharisees and Jesus, doesn't it? And imploring, they found him petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. "Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any man who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den?" And the king answered, "As a law of the Medes and Persians." Now the king obviously is ignorant of what's happening here. Okay, otherwise he would have never signed such a law. His pride blinded him didn't it? Because they came to you and said, oh, you're this great king, we should all worship you. Let's say that for 30 days nobody else is going to worship you. Well, that fed into his pride, and he walked right into that. So the king is at fault a little bit. To some extent, he bears some fault there because his pride blinded him to the scheme of his leaders. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king and the edict that you signed, for he prays 3 times a day, and as soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. Now, he wasn't displeased necessarily about Daniel praying. He was displeased because he knew he was in a bad situation. That his most trusted advisor, the person that he loved, that he wanted to look over his whole kingdom, had been caught, and he had been tricked and duped by these other evil men, and now his reputation was on the line if he didn't uphold the law. So what happens? He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver them. Then these men went to the king and said to him, you as king know it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king, begrudgingly I might add, gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Now, we're used to seeing the lion's den as this cute little place with fuzzy lions, and the lions are smiling, and maybe they have one little tooth, and it's kind of a nice sunny day. And okay, but that is not at all what this is. This is a pit. This is a nasty pit with rotting carcasses and other elements of death from the last people that got thrown into the lion's den. And they harassed these lions and starved them to where they were angry and hungry. All right, so that as soon as you threw a breathing animal or body in there, they were going to be all over it. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. Now what an amazing statement, all right? That the king is saying, may your God rescue you, a pagan king. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. Okay, so the king was obviously very upset and anxious, probably expecting for Daniel to be eaten alive. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. Daniel, servant of the living God, he said, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Now that's an interesting statement, isn't it? To continually, right? Not just once, but to continually rescue you from the lions. Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They haven't hurt me, for I was found innocent before him. Also, I have not committed a crime against you, my king. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. And so Daniel was taken out uninjured, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den with their children and their wives. I want you to think about that. Their children and their wives had nothing to do with this, and yet they were condemned. And I want to pause just right there. We're going to go back and finish this, but I want you to think about that. Does our sin only harm us? No. It's like a disease, isn't it? And it spreads from us to our spouses and to our children. Those are the people that when we fail, when we have a moral failure, when we lack integrity, who does it hurt the most? It hurts them. And that's what happened in this story. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live in all the earth, may your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. And this is the king talking, the pagan king, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus also the Persian. So because of the personal integrity of one man the king and thus a nation was impacted forever. And so what we can see for ourselves is that it is imperative for us. It is imperative for us as believers, of those that claim verbally to worship the one true God, for our lives to reflect that. So, we kind of glorified earlier an era of time, but there's one problem with the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that problem was that how people acted on the outside was not a very good reflection of what was happening in the home. And there was a big disconnection that people, you think authenticity is an issue now, and we're just now reading about all the horrible things that people did, the way that men beat their children and their wives, things that you would never talk about in that culture, those things that were shunned because there was such a fake and surreal glaze over those things in that time. It was just unheard of that you would speak of such a thing. That everything just looked rosy and happy on the outside. And so there's always moral decay. There's always failure in every culture and in every decade of every century. But yet, as a culture, as a nation, we have a choice to be moving in a direction. We can be moving away from God and away from absolute truth, or we can be moving in the opposite way. So where does that leave us? 1 Timothy 4:15 says this, "Take pains with these things. Be absorbed in them so that everyone will see your progress." Okay? Now notice what it says. They will see your progress. In other words, where you were and where you've grown to. Not that so everyone will see your righteousness, your perfection, because we know that ultimately and consistently that is nearly impossible for us. Be conscientious about how you live and what you teach. Persevere in this, because by doing so you will save both yourself and those who listen to you. So what's at stake? Us and the people around us. See, that's what's at stake by our choices, by our morality, or our lack of morality. See, I think that some of us, we're under this premise that God is like this great judge, and so there's like this fun and exciting way to live life, and He is in the way. He's standing in our way of experiencing that. But the truth is, and please hear me on this, the truth is that God is on the other side, and He is actually trying to stand in the way of us in destruction. That the way that we think that leads to life actually leads to death, and He is trying to prevent us from wrecking our lives. Because we're like that toddler in a lot of ways that sees the glow on the stove and we're just drawn to that. We just want to reach out and touch that. And our parents know, our moms know, our dads know that that will burn us and that we will walk away with the hurting finger for many days if we touch that. And so they try to prevent us, even though we just, every chance we get, we're just run away and try to touch that hot stove. But you know what happens for the healthy and normal toddler? They wake up one day, perhaps having burned themselves on the stove, and they realize, man, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to touch that stove anymore. See, that's the choice that we have. We can just keep being like the toddler, or we can decide to grow up. And we can be like our Father, who lived a sinless life, who died and reigns in heaven as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who sacrificed everything for us while we were yet sinners. He didn't condemn us. He didn't judge us. In fact, He sacrificed Himself so that we wouldn't be condemned, so that we wouldn't be judged for our sins. And so we must do the same for the people in our lives. Let's take some time and pray. Lord, you know I have hated preparing for this message all week because I hate the way that it makes me feel. When I see your standard of righteousness and I see you sitting in your glory I see the love that you have, the compassion that you have for people. I feel so spiritually bankrupt. And I look at our churches, I look at the Christians in our culture, and I realize that we're all bankrupt. That we need you to move and to touch our lives, to change us. And yet we stand continually in your way. You try to help us, and we just keep reaching for that stove. Oh Lord, would you have mercy on our sin? Would you have mercy on our wickedness, on our evil desires? Lord, would you fill our hearts with grace, that we would have compassion towards the people that are around us that are hateful and angry and jealous and selfish, that we would love them in spite of that. And that we would gently share truth with them. That we wouldn't just cover up our pot of gold, but that we would try to share some bricks with them. Lord, at the end of the day, when we've done our best, all we can do is come to you in prayer and hope that you will do a mighty work in our lives, that you would use us, that you would use our church for your glory. Lord, we've seen repeatedly, and today, just with Daniel alone, we've seen how one person can change the world. Oh Lord, would you use us? God, I pray for every person that's hurting today, that's struggling, that's suffering, that's wavering between the life that you've called us to live and the life that the world sucks us into. Lord, would you grant us a spirit of resolve today, that we would decide that character does matter, and that our integrity, our honesty, our word, our sacrifices are of the utmost importance, and that you've called us to more than just a life of wallowing in the mud. And so we seek you and your kingdom and your righteousness. And would you add all the rest of these things that we need? In Jesus' name.